Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Well, the question has become unavoidable, if unutterable in civilized circles. With an election of reckoning, one way or the other, dead ahead, are Democrats and radical progressives willing to do anything to defeat President Trump? Or more precisely, is there anything they are unwilling to do if they believe it will take down the evil orange man? And this leads to the real money question. Would the Democratic Party be willing to trash the country, to be responsible for thousands or millions of people suffering needlessly and the system crashing, if it meant removing this plague on the land called Trump? On the surface, of course, this would appear to be an unfair question. After all, from the time America's first president, George Washington, voluntarily relinquished the highest office in his land for the first time in world history to the duly elected second president, John Adams, the party out of power has served in a capacity taken for granted through almost 2.5 centuries: the loyal opposition. This expression, loyal opposition, does not mean members of the out party are loyal to the person of the president, but to the office itself and the laws and institutions of this constitutional republic. Simply put, though out of power, the opposition remains committed to the betterment of the nation itself. Is it possible to say that about the Democratic Party circa 2020? The party still refuses to accept the result of a legitimate election 4 years ago, spied with impunity on its political enemy, concocted Russia collusion out of whole cloth, ginned up a fraudulent impeachment, and so many other things you can't even count them. Now it remains silent or supportive as the forces of Marxism, that means tyranny, anarchy, that means chaos, and nihilism, that means the belief in nothing, openly call for the destruction of life as we know it. There's a legitimate argument to be made that the forces behind this revolt, and by implication those who stand by and allow it to happen, are even worse than the Marxist revolutionaries of the 20th century who had the blood of hundreds of millions of innocents on their hands. Here's the difference. The Russians, Chinese, Cubans, and others who fomented revolution actually loved their homelands. They were tragically misguided, but they considered themselves patriots at their core. In stark and unmistakable contrast, the insurrectionists attempting to burn down federal buildings, rip apart communities, target police, openly profess hatred for America. They desire the annihilation of our way of life with no plan for what would replace it other than pure anarchy. Think Venezuela. These despicable criminals, emboldened by the tacit, if not explicit, approval of an American left deranged to the core by one man, have pulled off a double hijacking. First, their uncontrolled violence brought to a screeching halt the legitimate conversation on police reform for which the entire nation, was finally ready. Then these mostly white criminals hijacked the broader and equally legitimate issue of racial justice and set it ablaze. So now we're supposed to believe these spoiled, rotten, good-for-nothing white millennial outlaws should be the face of our quest for racial equality? God forbid. Donald Trump has done what any president should or would do in such circumstances: condemn the violence and offer federal assistance to stop the rioting, looting, and destruction of innocent lives and businesses and communities. But what has been the Democratic Party's response? Leftist mayors in more than 24 cities have not only refused or condemned federal involvement, but have said nothing and not lifted a finger to stop an insurrection by people transparently uninterested in actual racial justice, except, as with the Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot and the Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler recently, when they're forced to do so at political gunpoint. They've refused to call the criminals criminals. They will not round them up. They will not deliver justice to the thousands of people victimized by their leaders' reprehensible refusal to honor their most basic responsibility, to keep their citizens safe. They've unleashed an exodus out of urban America which, absent a sea change in this regime of virtually permanent urban democratic leadership, will leave those remaining in our hollowed-out urban centers at the mercy of left-wing extremists. And what about the life-sustaining jobs that fell victim to COVID-19? Democrats far and wide have made clear they desire to keep the country and the economy shuttered as long as possible. And oh yeah, they don't want our children going back to school either. They condemn something that saved lives, hydroxychloroquine, because Trump approves of it and declared that this president has the blood of more than 170,000 coronavirus victims on his hands. They perpetually fearmonger and ignore any upticks in the prospects regarding the virus or the economy, even as so many souls fight despair and depression daily and strain to make sense of this pandemic that's overtaken so many lives. As people struggle to come to grips with this not-so-brave new world, Democrats provide not a glimmer of hope, but only despair and unfiltered hatred. Now, this strategy may be evil, but it's not complicated. It goes something like this. If we scare people to death and force them to remain fearful and sheltered, call Trump an evil white supremacist, or lately Mussolini, according to the once respectable James Clyburn, and keep people focused on sickness, unemployment, and misery, maybe they'll blame Trump and vote him out. To hell with those whose lives have slipped into the abyss through this damnable pandemic. They're nothing more than pawns in the left's political chess game to take down a duly elected president by any and all means which avail themselves. The nation be damned. Okay. I'll admit that Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer probably would not fire an actual gunshot at Trump. But what, beyond that, would you rule out in their thirst for power? Take a while to consider. Are these the actions of a party of loyal opposition committed to a better America?